Somebody needs to mute, probably Jeremy. I'm hearing kids in the background. So we started the meeting. Welcome back to Mayim, Chayim, Beit, Midrash. We're going to do session 8 of our Joshua survey tonight. I'm going to try my best to stick close to my notes so that we get through the material. I think this is going to be a very exciting study. Last week I thought was a lot of fun. We didn't get through chapter 9, but that's okay because it was what it was. I mean, we went long enough, I think. So hopefully I'll go a little bit less time tonight. So we're going to pick up where we left off, but we're going to backtrack a couple of verses to chapter 8, verse 33, for the reason of reviewing the verses we had read right at the end of the study last week. I know there was a few people that didn't make it to the end of the study, so they'll benefit from this. So I'm going to go ahead and read verses 33 through 35 of Joshua chapter 8. It says, "And all Israel and their elders and officers and their judges stood on this side of the ark and on that side before the priests and Levites, the bearers of the ark of the covenant of the Lord, the stranger as well as the native born, half of them over against Mount Gerizim, and half of them over against Mount Ebal, as Moses the servant of the Lord had commanded, to bless the people of Israel first. And afterward he read all the words of the law, the blessing and the curse, according to all that is written in the book of the Torah. There was not a word of all that Moses commanded which Joshua did not read before all the congregation of Israel, with the women and the little ones and the strangers that walked among them." All right. Now, this issue of Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal is commented on in the Talmud quite extensively. I'm only going to share one little note. But in Tractate Soda 33b, which is when you, and so just in deference to Carla, since she asked this question last week, when you're dealing with the Talmud, just a quick little instruction is that what the Talmud is, the Babylonian Talmud particularly, and it's the same format as followed with the Yerushalayim Talmud, but you have the Mishnah, which is the basic skeletal structure of the oral law, and then the Mishnah is combined with what's called the Gemara, and the combination of the two forms Talmud. So what Gemara is the discussion of the Mishnah by the sages of the Babylonian period over, really several hundred years, where they debate and raise questions and hash out the particulars of how to apply the Mishnah, basically. I did a whole class in Derek Hashem on this whole thing. So when we talk about these tractates, the tractates are the sections of the Talmud, the various, you wouldn't call them chapters. They're bigger than chapters. They're tractates. They're sections.
Volumes.
Volumes. Yeah. Thank you. So when I say 33b, so in an actual original Talmud, you would have a first side of the page, and then you would have a second side to the page. And this is why sometimes when you're reading the folios of Talmud, it appears as though the folios end and begin at weird junctures. Like why is this ending? Because they have the whole program of a daf a day. Many scholarly Jews or studious Jews follow the daf a day program, which will take you through the entire Talmud, Babylonian Talmud, in 7 years, basically. And you'll find that many of the sections will end in the middle of a sentence. And the reason is because when you see, say, 33a, that's 33 first side of the page. 33b is second side of the page. So when you have these published volumes of Talmud that get released now, they follow and they honor the original page divisions of the original sages, and that sometimes makes for some odd placement of the breaks, and that's the reason for that. So A and B is basically pages. So when I say first side, second side, I'm referring to basically an old school method of referring to the folio, the page number. So this is Soda, page 33b. Okay, and in that section, Rabbi Eliezer of the Talmud contends that Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal were merely small hillocks that were created by Israel for the occasion of this event of proclaiming the blessings and curses. Now remember, they're near the valley where the river is, where the river Jordan is. So this was raised by the sages as an objection to how could they have done this on a mountain when there's no mountains directly near the river. And so the answer was that it was actually a small hillock that ceremonially were created by Joshua for the purpose of this event. So this was an event that the nation participated in. This wasn't just a literary device. This was actually something that the nation saw and participated in. This contrast of blessings and curses. It would place these little hillocks very near, according to the Talmud, where Israel crossed the Jordan, and of course that suggests to us that this event would have actually been something that predated the conquest of Jericho, and that's what the general consensus of the sages is, that this book of Joshua, not everything in it is sequential. That there's certain elements in it that are put into the narrative out of their chronological sequence, and this was an example of that. So that's why I mention it. Just an interesting little notation for us to know. And in verse 35 of chapter 8, this was an interesting verse. It says, "And the strangers that walked among them." Very, very interesting verse. I got some chat messages here. Let's see what's going on. Oh, my camera's off. Yeah, thank you for telling me. I didn't even realize that. Okay, let's fix that. And I have to unplug my mouse so that you guys can see me with my camera. Okay, let's see if that works. I'll have to, oh, there we go. You should be able to see me now. Nope. What the heck? Hello. Goodbye. Hello. I don't know why it's doing that. It should be, let's see that. Hello. I'm back. All right. Sorry, but I didn't realize my camera was off. I appreciate you telling me. Yeah, thanks, Jeremy, for that link, Safaria. So, yeah, so Carla, if you want to, kind of understand what I'm talking about, Jeremy posted that link there so you can see the actual text that I was quoting there. I wasn't really quoting it. I was just referencing it. All right. The strangers that walked among them. So it says that Joshua read the entire Torah to both Israel and the strangers among them equally. That's very important. Chabad maintains that the deep elements of the Torah should not be taught to non-Jews unless they are on a path to conversion. This is something that I've had to discuss with Rabbi Mentz. However, according to the sources, traditional Jewish sources, this is an approach that is really unique to different organizations. It's not necessarily a halakhic position. It's a position that I believe has been adopted by many Jewish communities as a form of self-protection, to protect them against the potential negativity of people being in their midst that are not of the right motives or could cause them harm. I think that's one element, and I think there's another element that when you understand Kabbalah, as I've been studying it, you realize that when you look at the division between the Jewish people and the nations don't really need to engage with certain elements of Torah in terms of its application. So there's certain elements of the Jewish community that believe it's inappropriate for people from the nations to study certain portions of Torah, that they should only be engaged with the portions of Torah that relate to the Noahide commandments. There are others who are, and this is not Orthodox versus liberal Judaism. This is a cross section you're going to find in different denominational structures of Judaism. There's a wide variety of opinion on this. For instance, in the Breslov movement, that's not an opinion that's shared by Breslov. Breslov believes that everyone should be learning as much Torah as they possibly can handle, because it only elevates and refines them, and it helps the Jewish people ultimately. So this is not meant to be critical of Chabad, because Chabad has a particular mission and focus in their shuls to reach Jews. They're not trying to reach non-Jews. They're trying to reach Jews. So it's consistent with their mission and methodology. So I don't want to insinuate that I'm being critical. But it is a distinction. Traditionally, in Judaism, anyone who chooses to can draw near to Torah and learn, just like native-born Jews. And this passage here in Joshua illustrates this, and the sages back this up, the idea that there were strangers, many strangers, who came with them from Egypt, and they sat and learned Torah just like everyone else. And there was no need to separate the camp, so to speak. You know, it was whoever wanted to engage, they were expected to. I mean, honestly, they were part of the community. And it's important to know that there was a constant stream of strangers entering the fold of Judaism and joining the Jewish people throughout Jewish history. It ebbed and flowed depending on what was going on. But according to Radak, great Jewish sage, that this has always represented the thinking individuals of the nations. That according to Radak, there have always been people of the nations throughout Jewish history who have, through their own introspection and analysis, have become enlightened to the truth of Torah and have drawn close to learn. And that's an important thing for us to know, because it's tempting to think that this current revolution of Torah learning that's going on among Christians in certain segments of Christianity is somehow some brand new thing that, you know, that somehow it indicates that we're at the end times. You know, we're at the end. Maybe we are at the end times, but in reality, I think it's as much to do with the fact that we have the ability now with the internet for people to access stuff that was more difficult for people to access before. I mean, nowadays, even among the Messianic Hebrew roots movement, so to speak, and various other groups that are not associated with those elements, I find that even in the groups that I've been part of, very few people are actually engaged with actual Jewish community. Most people are doing things strictly online. And unfortunately, although you can learn a lot by just simply studying online, it's not a bad thing by any stretch. I mean, here I am, I'm online. The reality is that you can get some misapprehensions about what being Jewish really is when all you do is study the theological, philosophical perspective on the religion, and you never engage in the ethnic culture of the people, because there's something that transcends the theology when you're dealing with a people. You're now dealing with layers of custom and tradition and family life and community life and personal identity, and very rallying points of human experience are found in community. They're not found in theological studies. And unfortunately, a lot of the debates that go on, about all the different positions and perspectives and approaches to the faith, really are mostly being had by people who are not physically engaged in Jewish community. Because if you're engaged in Jewish community, you're engaged with the people that you're in community with. And you may learn outside of that community, which is perfectly healthy and acceptable, but that is not the same thing as rubbing elbows with and sharing table fellowship with people, where all of a sudden, our black and white opinions about how things are supposed to be get quickly challenged by the realities of real life on the ground. A lot of people can pontificate about their moral stances on things until they find themselves sitting across a table with somebody who is diametrically opposed to us politically and otherwise, and yet we're laughing and sharing bread with them and finding a human experience that's joyful and full of vigor in a way that, if we had not engaged in that, we would never want to be associated with those people because they don't agree with us. And this black and white thing, this kind of diametrically opposed polarization that goes gets quickly mitigated. You know, all you got to do is think about your workplace. If you work a job, I don't care what your convictions are on a variety of subjects. If you have to work with people as part of your way to make a living, you're going to quickly realize that there's a lot of things that you're going to shut your mouth about in order to keep peace in the workplace, because otherwise you're going to find yourself out of a job. It has nothing to do with your opinions. It has to do with the fact you've got to work together. And your boss is not going to tolerate you constantly being in people's faces about things you don't agree with in their personal life particularly, because that's not what you're there for. And that's one of the things that people don't realize, and is in Jewish community, if you're Jewish, you're Jewish. It doesn't matter what your politics are. It doesn't matter what you think about anything. It matters that you're part of the family. And that's something that I think evangelicals coming into Jewish learning have a tremendously difficult time understanding. Everything is a theological question with them.
But wait, if you're Christian, aren't you Christian?
Yeah.
It doesn't work the same way. It's not the same.
It's not quite the same. That's a great point, Jeremy. That illustrates what I'm saying exactly, because in Christianity, it's all about believing a certain doctrine. And if you don't believe this doctrine, well, you belong in that church over there. You know, if you don't believe in the gifts of the Spirit, you're not supposed to be over here. You're supposed to be over here in that primitive Baptist church. You know, you're not supposed to be here with these people because you don't fit. Well, in Judaism, if you're Jewish, you fit anywhere there's Jews. I mean, it's just, people don't realize that. I mean, I go to Gesher LaTorah, and there's people that come there that are part of the Chabad shul down the street in Alpharetta, and they show up in Cumming, they show up in Alpharetta, they go to Gesher LaTorah, they'll go down to the Jewish Community Center for the rabbi down there, they'll participate in the Atlanta Film Festival, they'll be all over the map. You know, but evangelicals, no, they're gonna demarcate themselves based on philosophy and morality and doctrine and politics. And that's evangelicalism is much different. It's just a different animal. You're still dealing with people, and you still have some overlap of some of these things I'm talking about, but it's just a different thing. And it's when we get back into Derek Hashem, we're going to understand better this idea, because the Ramchal is going to get into this in section 2 of the book. He's going to get into this idea of the identity of being Jewish and what it means, and it's not related. It's the central argument, I have to tell you, is not Acts 15. I'll just tell you that. Acts 15 does not set the conversation on this. It's way before that. It has to do with the creation of the world and what God's trying to do with the planet and everything. It has nothing to do with Acts. So anyways, I'm way off my notes here, which I promised I wasn't going to do. So here we are. So let's get back to the text of Joshua. We're going to get to chapter 9. I'm going to hopefully finish chapter 9 and get into the first few verses of chapter 10. We'll see if that happens. But let me start with chapter 9, verse 1 through 2. Excuse me, I have an itchy nose. Thank you. And it was when all the kings were on this side of the Jordan, in the hill country and in the valley, and on all the shore of the great sea opposite Lebanon, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite, heard of this, that they gathered together to war with Joshua and with Israel with a single accord. What did they hear of? What did they hear of? According to tradition, it's worth noting, only 6 of the 7 Canaanite nations actually remained after the conquest of Jericho, because the Girgashites had apparently evacuated the land and left for Africa to avoid confrontation with Israel, which is amazing. So an entire people picked up tent and left. But when we see this verse, they heard of it and gathered to war with Joshua with a single accord. What did the nations hear? What is the text referring to here? And the answer is that the Israelites had conquered Ai through stealth and strategy, and not through the miracle that happened at Jericho. And so because the nations observed that Israel resorted to stealth and strategic methods in order to conquer Ai, they determined that since they were fighting with their own wisdom, according to them, that if they gathered together and united their forces, that they would be able to overcome Israel. Whereas the miracle at Jericho just was awe-inspiring. I mean, it looked like there was divine intervention there. But this battle was a little bit more naturally supernatural, and the nations took courage in the fact that in their view, Israel was only succeeding because of their own ingenuity. So their idea was that if they could simply fortify their own cities and join their forces together, that they would have a different result than Ai, because their analysis, which was faulty, but the analysis of the nations was that Ai only fell because they were caught by surprise by the ambush. And this is according to the commentary Mezudath David. This also reflects in parallel the commentary of the sage Gersonides, who says that the nations recognized that Israel was stronger than any of them individually, and so they needed to band together. Interestingly, if you can, hello, how are you? It's nice to see you. Compare the.
How about you?
It's great to see you. You're on camera. I can see you. Compare this to modern Israel. So, when you look at the modern state of Israel, for all of its problems, many of its enemies, you look at the UN, for instance, they try to band together to come against Israel. It's the same pattern that we see here in the book of Joshua. Very interesting. You see this repeat. The way the nations respond to the presence of Israel is nothing new. It's the way it's always been, because God has his hand on his people. It creates a sense of deficiency and intimidation among the people of the nations who are not aligned with God. The commentator Alshich, if I said that right, excuse me if I didn't, says that after the victory at Jericho, Joshua sent epistles. This is what, not written in the text, but according to the rabbis, this is what Joshua did, and it makes the text make sense, is that before moving on from Jericho, Joshua sent letters to the nations surrounding. He offered them three choices. He said, those who wish to evacuate the land may do so. Those who wish to make peace may do so. And those who wish to wage war will wage war. So according to these options, the Girgashites evacuated, the Gibeonites made a deceptive form of peace, and the remaining nations waged war, and history shows us that all of them perished in that effort. The other thing that the kings heard, as far as what they heard of, is they heard that Joshua was building an altar and inscribing the Torah on its stones. And since the Torah can be thought of as the Jewish constitution, it was as if Joshua was establishing the law on foreign soil, according to them. He was, in essence, planting his flag on conquered territory, and in their view, he hadn't conquered it yet. And this created a threat to the kings of Canaan, and therefore they opposed him. We see this thought in Psalm 2, verses 1 through 3, which reads, why are the nations in an uproar and the people devising a vain thing? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us. In other words, let us cast off the bondage of this law. So the law being inscribed upon the stones was an offense to the nations, because Joshua not only was leading the nation into conquered territory, he was establishing that conquering through the law of Moses that had been given to the people. And it was a law that was to govern the land, and the people of the land did not want to be governed by it. That is why the nations rage against Israel, because they don't want to be under the law, so to speak. So 9:4, verse 4, as we continue with the text, we see that it says that, and they also acted with wile, talking about Gibeon, I'll read verse 3. And the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and to Ai, and they also acted with wile, meaning with deception, and they went and disguised as ambassadors, and they took worn sacks for their donkeys and wine bottles that were rotten and split and tied together. And it says in the verse, when it says they also acted with deception or wile, what does this mean? Rashi comments on this, the great 12th century Jewish commentator, says that just as Jacob's sons, this is very interesting, just as Jacob's sons dealt deceitfully with Hamor, the father of Shechem, who was a Hivite, the Gibeonites were also from the Hivites. Isn't that interesting? So we have this picture of measure for measure, where it looks on the surface that the Gibeonites are just simply plain deceptive. And yet when we read the Torah, we see when Jacob brings his family into Shechem, they deal deceitfully ultimately after in their rage against what was done to their sister Dinah. They react by telling the men, if we're going to join with you, you're all going to circumcise yourselves. And in their pain of circumcision, Levi and, not Reuben, Levi and, who was the other brother that did that? Jeremy, help me out. I just went blank. It was Levi for sure, and it was another brother. Not Judah, not Reuben. Anyways.
Simeon,
thank you. Levi and Simeon. When the men of Shechem were still in the pain of their circumcision, they went and they slew everybody. Just a great slaughter. It was deception. They got them to circumcise themselves so they would be in pain and immobilized. And so Rashi says that this was measure for measure, basically, that just as Jacob's sons dealt deceitfully with Hamor, and remember, Jacob was not pleased with this because on his deathbed, he mentions this, right, in the blessings over the sons. And that Gibeon basically has comeuppance here with Israel by the way they dealt with Israel. Very interesting. So, and it's worth noting as well that the place of Shechem is a very significant place in the analysis and the philosophies of Kabbalah, because it's at Shechem where the nations first seek to take the might of Israel away, to steal the might of God's people. It's interesting because Gibeon comes, and so now we can put Rashi's commentary on this, and we can realize that what Gibeon is doing is it's a reenactment of the nations trying to subversively steal the might of Israel. So that brings us to verse 5. I'm going to read verses 5 through 8. It's a very vivid story that I think many Christians know this story. Many others don't, but this is one of those stories that is known, I think, in various portions of the church. And we'll read verses 5 through 8. And worn, this is the Gibeonites, they had worn patched shoes in their feet and worn garments upon them, and all the bread of their provisions was dry and moldy. And they went to Joshua to the camp at Gilgal and said to him and to the men of Israel, and this is the leaders of the tribes, we have come from a distant land and now make a covenant with us. So that is significant now. If we understand that Joshua sent epistles out to the various people of Canaan, why the Gibeonites are telling them that they came from a distant land, not from locally. Because if they came from locally, then this would have been, the ruse would have been completely found out. It would have been like, if you're locally, what's with the worn clothing? But they said that, the worn clothing is representative of the fact they came a long distance, meaning they came from outside of Canaan. Therefore, they're portraying themselves as being outside of Joshua's injunction to either evacuate, make peace, or make war. So it's deception. It's not an honest dealing. And it says in verse 7 that each of the men of Israel said to the Hivites, perhaps you dwell in my midst, and how can I make a covenant with you? And they said to Joshua, we are your servants. And Joshua said to them, who are you, and from where do you come? So in verse 4, it says that they had these wine bottles tied together. Rashi explains this passage as a synonym for the concept of being split in his linguistic analysis. That the wine bottles are portrayed as being old, that they're not new wineskins, so to speak. Verse 6, it says, we have come from a distant land. So Gersonides comments on this. He says, meaning they are not included, therefore, in your law, which states you shall not spare any soul in the land. So the law states, now this refers back to what we mentioned a few minutes ago, that Joshua wrote the law on stones, and that law stated that Israel was not to leave any rebellious people of the land alive. And so, according to Gersonides, this is reverberated back to them by the Gibeonites, saying that basically we're not included in this because we're from a distant land. But then there's another interpretation from the Mishnah Torah by the Rambam in his book Law of Kings. It says that Gibeon, not being aware of Israel's law, thought that no one of Canaan would ever be accepted. So this goes back to what I mentioned earlier in the idea that Joshua was preaching the Torah to strangers. So not only are there legitimate elements within the Jewish world that doesn't want to teach the Torah to the nations in various aspects with distinction, but the nations have, in some circles, a faulty idea about the Jewish people, that the Jewish people somehow don't want to share what they have. This narrative gets built up among certain circles that, well, the Jews are just holding out. And believe it or not, this concept is actually very prevalent in anti-Semitic narratives, because one of the most common and long-standing anti-Semitic notions that exists is the idea that the Jews have a secret vault of treasure that they hoard for themselves that the nations can't get. There's always this narrative that always exists in all the countries of the world, even today, that says that the Jews run the banks of the world, and the Jews run the treasuries of the world, and the Jews are trying to run the world. And they're running it through money behind the scenes. And it's this idea that the Jews don't want to share. And we have to understand that this is the spiritual root of this accusation. It's not based in fact. It's not based in actual evidence. It's based on a spiritual root. And that spiritual root says that God has given Israel something that we don't have, and they're holding out on us. And we hate them for it. This is why the nations rage. Because Israel's been given a gift from heaven that the nations don't have. Now, if the nations were to read the law, they would know that part of the law stipulates that if the Jews don't share this light with the world, that they are held accountable by God for that. So in fact, a Jew who is trying to love and serve God is eager to share the riches of the Torah with anyone who wants to draw near. This is very important. But there's a perception which has to be overcome. And it's based on fear. It's we talked about this in the idea of the psychology of existence in the Derek Hashem series. The idea that the basic deficiency of man is the knowledge that we are not God. And the very knowledge that we are not God makes us want to scramble to cover ourselves with fig leaves because we feel like we don't measure up. And so anything that smacks of us not measuring up in the spiritual realm is a deep offense to the human psyche. So the very fact that God would arbitrarily choose a people is, by the very human condition of man, an offense to the nations. Jewish people don't even have to open their mouths. They don't even have to do a thing. They're automatically hated because God set them apart. Now, the people that don't hate them are those whose minds become illuminated with truth, and they recognize the beauty of the Torah and the beauty of what the Jewish people represent. But when we don't see that, it's sort of like, the nations are naturally prone to paganism. People don't realize that here in America. But if you look through human history, people always gravitate to pagan notions. Monotheism has to be taught. It has to be apprehended. And the beauty of Torah and the purpose of the Jewish people is something that has to be apprehended through the spirit man, through the godly soul. Because through the natural man, while we can certainly see, if it was just about logic and evaluation, if you look and realize that over 30% of all the Nobel Prizes that have ever been awarded have been awarded to the smallest population group on the entire earth, which is the Jews. Logically, you should realize, well, there's something going on there. Why is that? But that's not taken into account by those who hate God's people, because it's spiritually motivated. It's not motivated by logic. So we have this, we have to understand this as we look at this picture here in Joshua. The Gibeonites, according to Radak, the Gibeonites had heard of Joshua's offer of peace to Jericho, after which Joshua destroyed the city, and therefore they did not trust the outcome of accepting such an offer. Now that's an interesting analysis by Radak. And another commentator, the Abravanel, says that they were also perhaps averse to accepting peace and servitude under Joshua, since the peace terms included the acceptance of the Noahide laws and the secondary status to Israel in the changing landscape of the land. Think about what was just said there. You're presently occupying Canaan. Imagine you're one of these nations. And you have a nation coming in who seems to have the hand of the Almighty God upon them. And wherever he sends them, they conquer. So to accept Joshua's offer of peace is to accept the reality that Israel is going to set the laws of the land. So if you're going to be at peace with Israel, you're going to have to become righteous to live in the land with them, because they're going to establish the law of God. And if you're not willing to be righteous, you're going to have issues. Abravanel picks up on this, and he says the nations in Canaan didn't want to be righteous. They didn't want to be subject to those laws. So let's read further. Let's look further into the text. I think the implications of what we're seeing here, I think, are rich, and they apply to what we're dealing with and what we see today. So starting in verse 9, and they said to him, from a very distant land have your servants come because of the name of the Lord your God, for we have heard of his fame and all that he did in Egypt. See, this is supporting what I was just telling you. And all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites that were on the other side of the Jordan, to Sihon, king of Heshbon, and to Og, king of Bashan, who was in Ashtaroth. All of our elders and all the inhabitants of our country spoke to us, saying, take provision in your land, in your hand, for the journey, and go towards them. This is the Gibeonites speaking, and say to them, we are your servants, and now make a covenant with us. This our bread we took hot for our provision out of our houses on the day we set out to go to you, and now behold, it is dry and has become moldy. And these wineskins which were filled were new, and behold, now they are split. And these our garments, our shoes are worn, and our shoes are worn because of the very long journey. And the men, who's the men? Remember I told you who the men were? The men are the leaders under Joshua of the tribes. The men took of their provision and did not ask counsel of the mouth of the Lord. That's what it says in verse 14. So when we look at that verse and we analyze it, and the men took of their provision and did not ask counsel of the mouth of the Lord, the text here is being critical of Israel's leaders. Because 16th century Rabbi Alsich, I want to add an L in there incorrectly, he notates that the text here is critical of Israel's leaders, and he says why. Because only the bread and the wineskin showed signs of age. But the other provisions that they carried were fresh and well preserved. So the men, the leaders of Israel, should have noticed the inconsistency in the Gibeonites' testimony, and they should have sought the Lord for wisdom. But they didn't. And because they didn't, they entered into an agreement that ultimately was detrimental to them. And then we continue on in verse 15. It says, Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live, and the princes of the congregation swore to them. And it was at the end of 3 days, after they had made a covenant with them, that they heard that they were their neighbors and that they dwelt among them. And the children of Israel journeyed and came to their cities on the 3rd day. And their cities were Gibeon and Chephirah and Beeroth and Kiriath Jearim. And the children of Israel did not smite them, because the princes of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. And all the congregation complained against the princes. And all the princes said to all the congregation, we have sworn by them, by the Lord, the God of Israel. Now therefore we may not touch them. This we will do to them and let them live, and there will be no wrath upon us because of the oath that we swore to them. So apparently, according to the Torah and the analysis of the sages, it wasn't Joshua who made this covenant with the Gibeonites, but it really was the work of the leaders of the people. But Joshua was obligated to uphold it. And it's interesting that the land that the Gibeonites would occupy was principally the land of Judah and Benjamin, which were later the tribes that would be loyal to David after Solomon's son split the kingdom. It was always Joshua and Benjamin, not Joshua, Judah and Benjamin, that were loyal to David. In fact, that was the origin of the name Jew, actually. The term Jew comes from the idea of Judah, Yehudi. So, we'll read verse 21 now to the end of the chapter, and we'll comment on that, and we'll take a quick breather, and then if we have time here, we'll get into chapter 10. So verse 21, it says, and the princes said to them, let them live. So they became hewers of wood and drawers of water to all the congregation, servants, as the princes had spoken to them. And Joshua called for them, and he spoke to them, saying, why have you deceived us, saying, we are very far from you, when you dwell among us? And now you are cursed, and there shall never fail to be slaves from you, and hewers of wood and drawers of water for the house of my God. And they answered Joshua and said, because it was certainly told to your servants how the Lord your God commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land from before you. And we were very afraid for our lives because of you and have done this thing. Now behold, we are in your hand, and it seems good to you and right to you to do to us, do. And he did so to them, and he delivered them from the hand of the children of Israel, and he did not slay them. They did not slay them. And Joshua made them that day hewers of wood and drawers of water for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord to this day in the place which he would choose. So, interestingly, hewers of wood and drawers of water for the house of my God. Rashi says on this, Rashi says, because of their deception in approaching Israel, David later decreed that they could never join the Jewish people. This is David's decree later. There was actually a marital ban from the Israelites marrying the Gibeonites. This is according to Rashi. And I find it interesting because in modern times, those of us who have come to Torah through the movement, sometimes are insensitive to the fact that the Torah movement really has its origin in a missionary attempt to reach Jews for Jesus. And originally, whatever your particular opinion might be about this organization, Jews for Jesus really they promoted putting up a front of Torah observance for the strict purpose of trying to get observant Jews interested in hearing about Jesus. The idea being that if we could present Jesus as a Jewish guy and that we are following Jesus Jewishly, that we would entice and interest observant Jews to explore the promises of Jesus for themselves. And for those who believe and follow this mindset, they consider themselves very noble in this effort. But ultimately, it's a deceptive practice to try to take on Torah observance for the idea of missionizing Jewish people is beyond insulting. And really, it is exactly what the Gibeonites did to Joshua. So I would really caution anyone who thinks it's a good idea to draw close to Jewish people or to draw close to Torah because you think somehow you'll be a testimony for Jesus or Yeshua in their midst, and then you're gonna wait for your opportunity. You're going to have them over for Shabbat, or you're going to have that key conversation, during the oneg where, this teaching that we heard today, it reflects very positively upon Apostle Paul in the book of Romans, and, you can compare them really well, and a lot of Kabbalistic ideas between the New Testament and the Old Testament and Jewish thought, and, maybe you should consider this. Maybe you should come join my group. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the Kabbalah of the New Testament. And, uneducated Jews will, oh, that sounds really interesting. Yeah, my rabbi hasn't really been paying much attention to me lately. I guess I'll go join this group over here, and maybe I'll go to their Messianic synagogue. And, this is a tragedy for the Jewish community when this happens because it's deceptive. And I just want to put a warning out to anyone who thinks that this is a worthwhile objective, that somehow the ends justify the means, because when we look at the Gibeonites, what was their fate for deceiving Joshua? Yes, they established themselves a covenant of peace, but they were forbidden from ever joining the Jewish people because they deceived their way in. If you want to put a no entry sign up in your face before the Jewish people, deceive your way into the community. Because once you're marked as a deceiver, you will never be accepted. Ever. By a miracle of God, perhaps, if you change. But it's a very bad thing. It's much, much better and respectable if you are a Christian. When you go into Jewish space, if somebody asks you who you are, tell them honestly what you are. I'm a Christian and I'm curious to learn. That is a perfectly acceptable and respectable response. No rabbi will have a problem with that. What they have a problem with is when you act like you're Jewish when your real job there is to try to entice Jews to become Christians. So you have to be very, very careful, because the Jewish community can be a very fragile place. And just like any community, it's the same thing as churches. There was times in years past, there was a program that I participated in back when I was still Christian called Tent of David. And Tent of David was an idea that to try to go into the church and introduce Torah observance to the church. You start telling people they needed to do Sabbath and festivals and all these other things, and give a big apologetic as to why they should do that. And ultimately, if you're a pastor of a church and you have a set trajectory that you're following, and you have a group of people that come in that think they're doing some great work of God, and they start telling all your congregants that, we're pagan, we should be doing the festivals. We should be doing Shabbat. We should be doing a Passover Seder. Well, it's one thing to, like Jeremy has led Seders. It's one thing when people just want to learn because they're curious about the connections. That's totally healthy and fine. But when you're telling the church, who already has a religious stratagem that they're following, that what they're doing is wrong and they need to change, you're doing violence to that community, whether you like it or not. You might think, well, yeah, but I'm right. Yeah, well, sometimes you can be wrong even when you're right. You can't see me? Oh, that was an old message. Okay, hold on. Sorry. I guess Jeremy. No, it's not a question. Kevin raised his hand. He wants to say something. Go ahead, Kevin. You hear me, Kevin?
Yeah, I hear you. What,
Okay.
the synagogue I went to earlier this year, they had a real big problem and they were hurt by a couple that came in, and they had invested everything into this couple, welcoming them into the community, and going through the teachings. They were acting and participating and everything, and then in the background they were witnessing to everybody,
Right.
and that was hurting to that community because all of a sudden they changed characters after a year of being ingrained into that, and they wounded the Jewish community there because they, and
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I mean,
yeah,
yeah, even here locally, I mean, Rabbi Mentz here in Cumming, who I love Rabbi Mentz. I consider him a friend, and I support the community, and they were hurt in a similar way. And that's a small community, a fledgling community that's just trying to get off the ground, and it's very damaging when that kind of stuff happens. And a similar thing happened down in one of the Chabad's. No, it wasn't a Chabad. I think it was at Beth Jacob in Atlanta, and I'm sure it's happened elsewhere, but you're absolutely right, Kevin, 100%. In fact, when Rabbi Mentz found out I had a teaching ministry, it was an issue for him because right away the red flags go up. Now, I know where I'm coming from, and you guys all know where I'm coming from, and Jeremy stuck up for me. And Rabbi and I had a long talk, and, I think he was comfortable with what I told him. But it still puts up a red flag. It's something that they had to be very, very careful. I mean, as much as Rabbi likes me, he doesn't want me going in there and, in his view, recruiting people to my teaching ministry, and that's what somebody was telling him I was doing. So, it's an instant point of tension because it's not appropriate, and I wasn't doing that, by the way. But the simple perception that was happening was enough to make a conversation necessary that was quite confrontational. So, Kevin, you're absolutely 100% right. I mean, think about the hurt. Think about any human relationship you have where you openly receive somebody and then you find out later that they were just using you for their own purposes. I mean, I don't care if it's a religious environment or not. You're going to feel betrayed. You're going to feel hurt. You're not going to be happy about it. And I just think, we need to be sensitive. And I think the only reason this happens, and I don't want to take a lot of time on this, it wasn't really in my notes to go this deep on this, but I think it's worth saying that it's the triumphalistic position of Christianity, of many Christians, I should say, that produces this. If you have the notion that in order for a Jew to become completed, that they have to have Jesus, for instance, or if you think, for instance, that the Jews have a lot of great teachings and they're really wise and they've done a great service by preserving the Bible and everything else, but I'm a little bit more enlightened than them by virtue of the fact that I'm a Christian and they're not. I have something they need, is the idea, that I have something that the Jew who doesn't know Jesus really needs. And so my obligation is therefore to somehow share my faith with them if I'm really going to be an honest witness. That's the motivation. It's not that they're trying to hurt the Jewish people. It's they're trying to walk out what they've been taught. And what they've been taught, as Jeremy says, is replacement theology. And so in order for us to have a proper understanding of this issue, we really have to debunk the replacement theology from our heads. And that can take time. And it can be a painful process because it's always unnerving and creates a sense of insecurity when something that we thought we were rock solid, totally fine with, we suddenly find out, oh no, we got to change our mind about that because we're wrong. No one likes to be wrong. And no one likes to be told they're wrong. Well, I won't get into it because it's too personal. But anyways, so let's move on. I think great comments, Kevin. Thank you very much for sharing that, because it illustrates exactly what we're talking about. So enough of that. We don't want this a negative thing. We're trying to focus on Joshua. But I think within this, I think the Gibeonites show us a picture of that, of what will happen. And it's not a good result. It's not a good result. You don't want to be relegated to a status that you're not going to want to live in, just because you're trying to avoid the temporary accountability. And that's what the Gibeonites did. So again, in verse 27, we have this repeat of hewers of wood and drawers of water. And it's interesting that during the time of the conquest of the land, the sages tell us that the Gibeonites were the servants of the entire nation. But once the land was conquered and the temple was built, they only served at the sanctuary. So the Gibeonites served the needs of the sanctuary and the priests. According to Abravanel, this was justice, and it was also a form of leniency. So the Gibeonites, even though they were relegated to service, they were still given leniency by Joshua, because they were given the service of the sanctuary in support of the Levites, rather than just being abject slaves of the entire nation. So they were given a job of dignity and purpose. And I think this is a beautiful picture of God's justice, that even when we screw up, there's still going to be, God's justice is exact. We have to understand this. When we get back to Derek Hashem, again, I'm mentioning it again, we're going to look at this again. God's system of justice is not arbitrary, it's not flippant, it's not muddy, it's not loosey-goosey. It is absolutely precise.
But it is important to note that the consequences are lasting.
Yes.
There are permanent consequences of it, so that the mercy and the justice there are both carried out.
Yeah,
Don't
that's
get off
good.
the hook, as it were.
Yeah, that's really good, Jeremy. Yeah, thank you for adding that comment. That's right on. Thank you. All right, we're doing good. Let's go for the home stretch here. How's everybody doing? Everybody doing all right? You guys are okay. I'm doing good. I got a page here, so I think we're on track. While Israel was still in military formation, Gibeonites would serve the entire congregation, as I already mentioned. But sparing their lives, meaning that they weren't killed for their deception, which, they could have been, and making them hewers of wood was a leniency, since they deserved death for the deception that they wrought. So let's go ahead, since everybody's doing well, let's jump into the verses we're going to cover in chapter 10, and we'll comment on that, and we'll complete the study for tonight. It came to pass when Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had taken Ai, and had completely destroyed it, as he had done to Jericho and her king, so had he done to Ai and her king, and that the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were among them, that they feared greatly, because Gibeon was a great city, as one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all her men were mighty. And Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, sent to Hoham, king of Hebron. I'm reading the English translation of Judaica, so if it's off, I'm sorry, but this is what they say. And to Piram, king of Jarmuth, and to Japhia, king of Lachish, and to Debir, king of Eglon, saying, "Come up to me and help me, and we will smite Gibeon, for it has made peace with Joshua and with the children of Israel." So they're mad at Gibeon. You see this now. The nations surrounding Gibeon are now ticked off at Gibeon because they made peace with Israel. Does that not sound familiar? Does that not have its reflection in modern political culture with Israel? Whoever is allied with Israel is hated by the nations that are against Israel. Very, very interesting. And they want to punish those nations who ally themselves with Israel. And the 5 kings of the Amorites, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, the king of Eglon, gathered together and went up, they and all their camps, and encamped on Gibeon, and made war against it. Well, interestingly, all the kings of Jerusalem were known by the name Zedek, righteousness. which is a precursor to the word Zadik, which is righteous one. So we understand that when a king is anointed, right? People sometimes think, well, Jesus was anointed of God. Well, his anointing was not any different than the anointing of the kings of Israel. All the kings of Israel were in some fashion a Messiah figure. They were all Zedek. They were all Zadik. They were all the righteous anointed ones of God. We see this, of course, in Genesis. I was just about to say this. Melchizedek, king of Salem, which was Jerusalem at that time. Okay? Center for righteousness and justice. That's what the name means. Jerusalem means center for righteousness and justice. Has it always exemplified that perfectly? Of course not. Has any human being ever perfectly exemplified righteousness and justice? Perhaps an intent. Yet God declares certain people righteous, even though they're not perfect. This is something that evangelicals need to wrestle with, because when we read in the New Testament these statements that Christians think declare the divinity of Jesus are not any different of a statement than what is declared over the kings of Israel. Because a king is a righteous one, considered righteous before God. He's going to be judged by God for his actions, but he's anointed over the people. We just have to understand this concept of anointing and what it means. It has nothing to do with whether you approve of the way he treated his wife. It has to do with the anointing that God gave for the office. So you read portions of Jewish texts, where you'll see things like, I'll just throw a name out, Rabbi Akiva or whatever, for whom heaven and earth were created. You'll see this in Talmud. You'll see this in the Midrash. You're like, whoa, what are you saying? Well, it's amazing how Christians don't blanch at all when things like that are said about Jesus. But then you read some Jewish text when it says that about some Jewish sage, you're like, hey, wait a minute. And we automatically assume, well, the Jews have no right to say that about this guy. Well, maybe we have no right to think what we think about what people are saying about Jesus, when really, if you put it in a Jewish context, they're saying the same things about him they said about other righteous people of the nation. For him, all the earth and heaven were created. He's not the only one in Jewish history that has had that said of him. It's a eulogy of sorts. It's an elevation of a great one among the people, and what he meant to the people. Tom Brady of the Patriots, they call him the GOAT. They call him the greatest of all time. Now, any given Sunday, any number of quarterbacks could outplay him. But he's still the greatest of all time, for whom all heaven and earth were created. We got to understand the terminology. We got to understand how it's used. So anyways, that's an aside. So, because Gibeon was a great city, in verse 2, it says, Gibeon was a great city, making peace rather than risking war. So they were mad at Gibeon because they made peace. Why? Because it demoralized the weaker city-states around them. Bravanel comments, he says that it created a backlash in which the remaining kings chose to gather their forces together to both fight Israel and to punish Gibeon for making an alliance, because on a military level, attacking Gibeon is going to threaten Israel's ability to use Gibeon cities as a military center. So on a very strategic level, even though Gibeon made this peace with Israel deceptively, it now grants Gibeon's fortified cities as a military station for Israel's armies. And so the nations of Canaan that are remaining are feeling very threatened by this. You know, it's bad enough we had to come against Israel and God. Now we got to come against Israel and God and the Gibeonites. That's it. Let's go get them. So what they do is they attack the Gibeonites. They don't attack Israel directly. They attack the Gibeonites. Caleb strongly objects to me calling Tom Brady the GOAT. I'm just quoting other people. I'm quoting the sources, Caleb. Okay, that was rich. So we get to verses 6 through 8. That's good. I'm glad he's listening. That's good. And the men of Gibeon sent to Joshua to the camp to Gilgal, saying, "Do not slack your hands from your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us and help us, for all the kings of the Amorites that dwell in the mountains are gathered together against us." So Joshua ascended from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, and all the mighty men of valor. And the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not fear them, for I have delivered them into your hand. Not a man of them shall stand before you." So we have to understand that Joshua had extreme reservations about risking his own people to defend another people who had dealt with Israel so deceptively. Now, this is interesting. You know, we have arguments, and this is not political, but I find it amazing that human beings no longer become human beings. Like, we have human beings that are suffering, and we make it a political battle because we say, well, what right do they have to be here? What right do they have to have our protection? Well, they're part of the human family and they're suffering. So my human obligation, not my political obligation, my human obligation is to care for people who are at risk, regardless if we think they deserve it or not. We might think, well, they shouldn't have done what they did. They shouldn't have committed that crime. They shouldn't have tried to cross the border. They shouldn't have done this. They shouldn't have done that. Well, guess what? The Gibeonites should not have made a deceptive covenant with Israel. But guess what? They did. They did. And you know what? You know what Joshua is going to do? He's going to go fight for them. He's going to fight for them because they're being attacked. And because they're being attacked, and because they are identified with Israel, whether that alliance was made by breaking the law or not, because they are identified with Israel now, Israel is going to fight for them. That's what Joshua is going to do. That's one of the things that makes Joshua righteous. Politically, he wants nothing to do with the Gibeonites. But morally, he must fight. And that's what Joshua does. Exactly what he does. And not only that, Hashem commands him to do it. Commands him to do it. This ends up becoming a cardinal principle of Jewish law and was also carried out by King David in reference to this event as he defends also the rights of the Gibeonites. And you have to look into the stories of King David to see that, but it's in the text. To this day, a mark of Jewish ethics, which is criticized by many, is to fight for marginalized and threatened peoples, regardless of whether they are worthy candidates based on their righteousness. It's not a matter of deserve. It's a matter of identity. The reality of Jewish ethics makes the current anti-Semitic climate, to change gears, of anti-Israel sentiment in respect to the Palestinians rather absurd. Many Jewish people are very sympathetic to the Palestinian state and to the people. They're sympathetic to the people who are suffering. They're not necessarily in agreement with the Palestinian leadership, but they still fight for the people. And this creates something that, again, this is not to be critical or political, but many evangelicals don't understand this. They're so focused on Israel being a sovereign state that anything that seems to be opposite of that objective, they automatically think is satanic. But guess what? The Israeli government's not perfect. And they commit atrocities too. And I'm not supporting Hamas. I'm not supporting any of the BDS. Or I think it's all atrocious. I think that the whole concept of BDS is absolutely evil. But we have to be understanding of the fact that we can't look at people from a political lens justified by our religion. We have to look at people as human beings. And if we can't be human in order to support our ideology, then maybe we should step back and reevaluate our ideology. What are we really standing for? And I'm saying all this, you might think that I'm suddenly saying that, oh, well, I totally support the Democratic Party. I told you already, I'm not being political. I'm talking about Jewish ethics as it relates to the story of Joshua here in chapter 10. Joshua goes and he fights for people who offended him. He fights for people who broke the law. He fights for people who deceived his leadership, who came to him under false pretenses. But he's going to fight for them. And because he does so, God's going to honor it. And I think it's really, really powerful that we see this picture here in Joshua. And then we go on and we read 9 through 12. It says, Joshua came to them suddenly. He had gone up from Gilgal all night. And the Lord confused them before Israel and slew them with a great slaughter at Gibeon. And they chased them by the way that goes up to Beth Horon and smote them to Azekah, I don't know, and to Makkedah. And it was as they fled from before Israel and were in the descent of Beth Horon, and the Lord cast down great stones from heaven upon them from to Azekah. That should be like, whoa, what is this? Great stones from heaven. And they died. And there were more who died with the hailstones than whom the children of Israel slew with the sword. And then Joshua spoke to the Lord on the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the children of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, sun, stand still upon Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon. And the sun stood still, and the moon stayed until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies. Is this not written in the book of Jasher? It's Torah. So the sun stood still in the midst of the heaven, and it did not hasten to go down exactly a whole day. And there was no day like it before it or after it, that the Lord hearkened to the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. We're going to end on verse 14 there, but I'm going to give you my commentary on that before we end, and then we'll wrap up. But it says, the Lord cast down great stones from heaven. In the Talmud, in Berachot 54b, the Gemara asks, what are the hailstones of Agavish? That's what it says in the Talmud. It is taught in the Midrash, they are the stones that remain suspended in the air and did not fall because of a man, an Ish, and they fell down because of a man. Gemara explains, they remain suspended because of a man, that is Moses, whom the verse refers to as a man. As it is written, and the man Moses was very modest, Numbers 12:3. And it is written, and Moses went out of the city from Pharaoh and spread forth his hands unto the Lord. The thunders and hail ceased, and the rain was not poured upon the earth, Exodus 9:33. Moses' hailstones remained suspended, and the stones descended because of a man. That is Joshua, who was also called man. As it is written, take Joshua the son of Nun, a man in whom is spirit. Numbers 27:18. And it is written that when Joshua and his people waged war against the army of the Amorite kings, God told him not to fear them because God would deliver them into his hands. And indeed, they died by means of these stones as they fled from before Israel while they were at the descent of Beit Horon, that the Lord cast down great stones from heaven upon them unto Azekah. And they died, and there were more who died with the hailstones than they whom the children of Israel slew by the sword, Joshua 10:11. Very interesting. And it says in verse 12, then Joshua spoke. So verse 12 and 13, this is very, very interesting. This is in the Midrash. It says, thank you for the link, Jeremy. is said to be a song of praise sung by Joshua, which caused the sun to stand still. This is a very, very interesting midrash. And I wanted to end with this because there's some rich stuff for us to see in this. And I wanted to end with these ideas. So this is cited by the Melchilta as one of the 10 songs mentioned in Scripture, this song that Joshua sings that causes the sun to stand still. Rashi comments on this. He says, he recited a song instead of the sun, meaning instead of the sun singing, since he had bade the sun to be silent, meaning be silent by refraining from reciting your song. And as long as it is silent, it stands still and does not continue in its orbit. For all the time of its revolutions, it recites its song. This is speaking of the sun. And as a side note here, I think this is fascinating because this is by Rashi. Many people mistakenly think that Rashi is simply about the Peshat level of understanding. But in fact, this really applies, when people say this about him, to his analysis of the text. He analyzes the Peshat of the text, but his interpretations are far beyond Peshat. Rashi gives interpretations that are rich with understanding. And that's why he's so revered as a Torah commentator, because Rashi's insights are just spectacular. He doesn't just comment on the literal text. He gives inference, he gives hints, and he gives applications that go far beyond, many times, what we would find in the literal text. And that's why he's so exciting. I love Rashi. Some people are very negative on Rashi. I think Rashi is fantastic. That's just my opinion. And I think a lot of people agree with me on that. Now, according to the Rambam, this is another interesting point, because the Rambam is considered by many to be the great, rational voice of Judaism. And yet, the Rambam says that this midrash on the Song of the Sun should be understood literally, because the Rambam believed that the heavenly bodies of the universe were literally alive in some fashion, and that they actually praised the Creator in a marvelous manner in the form of song. We find this in the Psalms, that the hills and the trees and the mountains cry out a song to the Lord. And Rambam reflects upon this, and he says that the heavenly bodies and the elements of the universe and the creation itself are actually alive. They actually praise Hashem. They praise him with their own song. And so this is fascinating, because what we have in the Midrash is we have this dialogue between Joshua and the sun, which is graphically portrayed in the Midrash. And it says, in the Midrash, it says that the sun maintained that it was older than man, having been created on the fourth day of creation, while Adam was created on the sixth day of creation. And Joshua responds to the sun. He says, but did not the sun, the moon, and the stars bow down before my grandfather Joseph? Are you not therefore my slave, bidden to do my command? The allegorical meaning, and those of you who have been in the Derech Hashem series will understand what I'm talking about here. The allegorical meaning is that man is the crown of the entire creation. And all that was created before, even the celestial bodies, is subservient to the Adam Kadmon, personified in this case by Joseph, which is another messianic allusion to Joshua. Joshua being an ideal man, able to command the sun. So according to the Midrash, Joshua asks for the sun to be suspended because the battle is on the sixth day, which is Friday, and he wanted the day lengthened so that they would not have to desecrate the Sabbath during the battle. Very, very interesting. And finally, in 10:14, it says there was no day like it before or after it. And my last little contribution here is from, again, from the Talmud, from Avodah Zarah 25a, which says that the Gemara cites a series of expositions with regard to what is called the Book of Yasher. The verse states, and the sun stood still, and the moon stayed, until the nation had avenged themselves of their enemies. Is this not written in the Book of Yasher? Joshua 10:13. The Gemara asks, what is the Book of Yasher? Rabbi Chia Bar Abba says that Rabbi Yochanan says, this is Genesis, which is the book of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who were called righteous, Yeshurim. As it is stated, let me die the death of the righteous, Yeshurim, Numbers 23:10. The Gemara asks, and where is it alluded to in Genesis that the sun would stand still for Joshua? The verse states in reference to Ephraim, who was Joshua's ancestor, and his seed shall become a multitude of nations, Genesis 48:19. The Gemara asks, when will he become a multitude of nations? He became a multitude of nations at the time when the sun stood still in place for Joshua. Excuse me, as it is written, and the sun stayed still in the midst of the heaven and hastened not to go down for an entire day. Joshua 10:13. And the Gemara goes on to give analysis and discussion about how long the time period actually was. But suffice to say that I think this is really rich. We have here a picture of an idealized leader who, when he reaches the place of Devachut, is able to command celestial bodies. Now, I'm sure your imaginations are running wild in terms of messianic parallels here, but I think in terms of Kabbalah, I think it's also very, very significant to realize that in Jewish spirituality, the pursuit of God and the pursuit of Jewish, of Devachut, of Emunah, of faith, of active faith, that's walked out, this sense of connectiveness to God, can result in putting us into a place where we have the ability to understand mysteries of the universe and the way that God works through his creation. You know, it's said of the Ari that he actually understood the spiritual purpose behind certain animals. That he knew why God made certain animals in the spiritual world. You know, and you might think, well, this is, you know, what is he, smoking crack? Well, no, it's part of prophecy. It's part of theurgy. It's part of this ability to be able to comprehend the spiritual universe. It's a sensitivity. I've talked before about how, you know, this idea of being filled with the Spirit really is a concept of consciousness. It's a concept of an elevated consciousness of God, of being aware that there's a dimension that the physicality of our being doesn't comprehend. So I think it's really fascinating that, you know, we would see this story of Joshua and the way that the sages analyze it. So I'm going to end there. And I think I succeeded in not going super long. And we'll end the recording and we'll have discussion time for those who want to participate. But I'm going to end the actual recording now. Thank you for listening. For those who are watching on video, Baruch Hashem, may you have a blessed week.